Welcome to our quick review talking a little bit about some of the problems with designing or with defining states. Sorry. The slides today are designed to accompany the textbook, The Cultural Landscape, and I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for today's lecture. So before we talk about defining states and some of the problems, really we have to review and talk a little bit about what are those characteristics of states, or how do we define states. So the basic characteristics of states are that they're politically organized territories that are administered by sovereign governments. That's a fancy way of saying basically that there is some kind of government, and that specifically that the government has control over the territory, and that there's some kind of a governmental system in place. And what that system is will vary from place to place. So it could be a republic, or it could be a democracy, it could be a dictatorship, um, could be an aristocracy. It'll vary from place to place. States need to be recognized by a significant portion of the international community, which can always be kind of a tricky one. They need to have defined territory. So in other words, we need to be able to draw a line around where is their territory on a map, and that territory needs to be generally agreed to. And also they need to have permanent populations. And so in other words, it can't be one of those places where people are constantly moving in and out, but there needs to be a steady and stable population, even as there is some in-migration and out-migration. So examples of states that are not at all, there's no difficulty in defining them clearly as states, would include the United States, of course, Mexico, Switzerland, Brazil, South Africa, China, the Ukraine, or rather, as my Ukrainian students like to say, simply Ukraine. Okay, these are some of the examples. There are many, many examples that we could use, but just know that those are some of the ones. Okay, and so part of the problem with defining states is that honestly, states change, right? States come together, they coalesce, they break apart. A great example of this is what was Yugoslavia, right? When I was in middle school and high school, is now several different countries. Okay, but the biggest thing you got to know is almost all of the habitable land belongs to a country today. Okay, in 1940 there were about 50 countries. Today there are about 192 countries, and we're going to use that United Nations membership as being kind of our guideline there, just so you know. And just bear in mind that a good probably 25% of those countries, give or take, have come into being over the course of my lifetime. And I'm 39 now. Okay, so roughly the last 40 years. And some places are difficult to classify. So for example, with Korea, do you characterize Korea as one state or two? Most people these days would go with two states, but a lot of Koreans would argue it's simply one state that's divided because of international conditions. We could talk about the Western Sahara, and for example, the breakaways, I'm going to massacre this name, Sahrawi Republic, okay? Or we could talk about South Sudan and Sudan, right? South Sudan is now a country. It's the most recently added country, but it's been a country for only about maybe 5 years or so. And polar regions would be one of those areas that is that there's lots of claims to, but that arguably doesn't necessarily belong to any one country, largely because of questions on who claims exactly which parts and where are the boundary lines and things like that. Okay, another great example of a country that might be potentially difficult to classify is Taiwan. Right? A lot of people would characterize Taiwan as being its own country. Certainly, it's got many of those characteristics, right? It's got a defined territory. It's pretty easy to draw a line around the island. It's got a sovereign government. There's a government that clearly controls Taiwan. Okay, it's got a permanent population, but it's not generally widely recognized as being its own country, right? In part because the role China plays in discouraging folks from recognizing Taiwan as being its own country as part of that greater one China policy. Okay, so there are countries that move kind of in and out of being countrydom. Okay, less so today than when we talk about historically. right? And the modern idea of a country or it's really something that we see in about the last 150, 200 years. We can talk about countries coalescing, especially in Europe and parts of Asia, sooner than that, but the modern, like what you and I think of as a country, is largely an invention of the last 200 years. Okay, China's an obvious exception in that they meet pretty much all of those four characteristics, and they have met it for a long, long time. But even with China, when you look at the history, there's times where the government controls the whole area, and there are times where the government doesn't control the whole area. So China's one of those where it has historically moved into and out of being what we would use defining as our four characteristics as being a country, even as it's had a continuous culture and for the most part a continuous government. Again, there are time periods where the government doesn't have widespread control. So if you have any questions about this, I'd be delighted to answer them. Please just bring them into class, and I guess I will see you the next time we meet.